My parents raised my rent to support my sister's freeloader boyfriend, so I left. Now they're desperate for me to return, but what I did instead will shock you. My name is Landon, and at 26 years old, I've seen my fair share of chaos, but nothing could have prepared me for the past few months. My parents, who had always prided themselves on being practical and fair, suddenly lost all sense of logic. They raised my rent, not to cover expenses for the home or to help with household improvements, but to fund my sister Olivia's freeloader boyfriend. It was the breaking point, and I decided enough was enough. For the past 2 years, I had been living at home to save money. Rent prices in our area were astronomical, and staying with my parents seemed like a sensible way to work toward buying my own place. The arrangement worked well at first. I paid a fair amount each month, helped around the house, and managed to save a decent chunk. My mom even liked to call me her responsible one, a title I wore with a bit of pride. That was before Olivia and her boyfriend, Aiden, moved in. Olivia is 22, but acts like she's stuck in her teenage years. She dropped out of college, can't hold a job for more than a few weeks, and brought Aiden into our home, a man who epitomizes the word deadbeat. He doesn't work, claims he's finding his passion, and spends his days lounging on the couch, scrolling through his phone, or raiding the fridge. Aiden's freeloading might have been tolerable if Olivia and my parents acknowledged it, but instead, they treated him like family. My parents doted on him, while I was expected to ignore the fact that he contributed absolutely nothing. At first, I tried to keep the peace. Olivia is my sister, after all, and I thought they'd only be staying temporarily. But as weeks turned into months, it became clear they weren't going anywhere. Then, about 2 months ago, my parents sat me down and told me they were raising my rent, doubling it, in fact. Their reasoning? With Olivia and Aiden living there, the costs for groceries and utilities had increased, and they felt it was only fair for me to contribute more since I was doing well financially. I was furious. I worked a full-time job, paid my bills, and contributed fairly, while Olivia and Aiden sat around draining the household finances. I told my parents I wouldn't pay extra to support freeloaders, but they didn't take it well. My mom accused me of being selfish and insensitive to their struggles, and my dad suggested I was ungrateful. Meanwhile, Olivia took every opportunity to make passive-aggressive comments about how easy my life was. The tension in the house grew unbearable. The breaking point came at a family dinner I reluctantly attended. My mom started lecturing me about doing my share, as if I hadn't been paying rent or helping around the house. When I calmly pointed out that maybe Olivia and Aiden should start contributing instead, the room fell silent. Olivia turned red with anger, and Aiden smirked in a way that made my blood boil. My dad scolded me. My mom looked like she was about to cry, and Aiden had the audacity to mutter something under his breath about jealousy. That was it. I couldn't take another second. I pushed back my chair, stood up, and told them I was done. If they wanted me to pay for Olivia and Aiden, they could forget it. I was leaving. I went to my room, packed a bag with the essentials, and called my best friend Logan. He'd been telling me for months that I should move in with him, and I finally took him up on the offer. When I came back downstairs, my mom was sobbing, pleading with me not to go. Olivia sat smugly next to Aiden, whispering to him like this was all a big joke. My dad just glared at me as if I had betrayed the family. I told them I'd return the next day to grab the rest of my things and walked out the door. That night at Logan's place, I felt more relief than I'd felt in months. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was carrying my family's burdens on my back. But the next morning, reality hit. My mom had flooded my phone with missed calls, texts, and voicemails. She begged me to come back, claiming Olivia and Aiden would change and that they needed me there. Even my dad, who rarely called me, left a voicemail accusing me of being selfish and abandoning the family. Despite Logan's reassurances that I'd made the right choice, I couldn't shake the guilt. My mom's pleas echoed in my head, and part of me wondered if I'd been too harsh. But as I sat in Logan's spare room, a simple space with a twin bed and old posters, it felt more like home than my parents' house ever had. The next morning, I knew I had to go back and gather the rest of my belongings. Logan offered to come with me, but I declined. I didn't want to drag him further into the mess. When I pulled into the driveway, my mom was already waiting by the front door. She looked exhausted, her eyes puffy and red. For a moment, I felt a pang of guilt, but I reminded myself that I wasn't the one who created this situation. As I got out of the car, she approached me cautiously. Her voice was shaky as she tried to justify their actions. She told me Olivia and Aiden were going through a hard time and that I didn't understand the pressure she and my dad were under. I stood in the driveway, stunned by my mother's words. Pressure? The audacity of it all made my blood boil. My parents were pressuring me to subsidize Olivia and Aiden's lives while they made no effort to contribute or improve their situation. My mother's voice trembled as she tried to justify it, but all I could think about was how simple the solution seemed. Olivia and Aiden could get jobs. I wasn't going to be their safety net anymore. Before I could respond, the front door swung open. Olivia stepped out, her expression smug and defiant, with Aiden trailing lazily behind her. He leaned against the doorframe, chewing a toothpick as if he didn't have a care in the world. Olivia crossed her arms and said something cutting, her tone dripping with condescension. Aiden muttered an offhand comment under his breath that only stoked the flames of my anger. I felt my frustration boil over as I turned back to my mom, gesturing toward Olivia and Aiden. Was this what she'd raised my rent for? To support their freeloading? Olivia fired back, accusing me of being selfish and self-centered, claiming my parents finally cared about someone other than me. Her words hit like a slap, not because they were true, but because of how delusional they were. For years, I carried more than my share of responsibility for the family, while she lived consequence-free. I didn't bother staying to argue. Instead, I pushed past them and stormed upstairs to pack the rest of my belongings. Olivia's smugness faded for a brief moment, replaced by something that almost resembled surprise. But I didn't care. I grabbed what I needed, made my way back to my car, and left without a backward glance. When I got back to Logan's place, I felt like I could finally breathe again. He didn't ask many questions, just handed me a beer and gave me a knowing look. I collapsed onto the couch, drained from the confrontation. Logan said something about my parents being blind to the way Olivia and Aiden were taking advantage of them, and I knew he was right. But it didn't make me feel any better. I was angry at my parents for enabling this, at Olivia for her entitlement, and at myself for letting it drag on for so long. That night, I blocked my parents' numbers. It felt drastic, but I needed the space. I couldn't keep dealing with their guilt trips and justifications. For the first time in weeks, my phone was silent. I tried to focus on the movie Logan put on, but my mind kept wandering what the fallout would be. The next morning, I woke up to an unexpected text, not from my parents, but from Emma, an old friend from high school. Seeing her message caught me off guard, but it was a welcome distraction. Emma had always been one of the few people who could make me laugh, even when things were bleak. We hadn't talked in years, but her message felt like a lifeline. She suggested catching up over coffee, and for the first time in days, I felt a flicker of something like normalcy. The week that followed was a blur. I settled into Logan's place, returned to my usual routine at work, and started to feel like I was regaining control of my life. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't constantly trying to fix everything for everyone else. But just as I was starting to feel like myself again, everything unraveled. I came home one evening to find Logan sitting on the couch, his expression uncharacteristically serious. He handed me his phone without saying a word. On the screen was a local news article. My stomach dropped as I read the headline, "Local couple arrested for shoplifting." Beneath it was a blurry photo, but I recognized them immediately, Olivia and Aiden. I stared at the article in disbelief. The same sister my parents had raised my rent to support had been arrested for stealing from a grocery store. It was so absurd, so surreal, that I didn't even know how to react. My mind raced, trying to process what this meant. Logan, ever the pragmatist, made a comment about how this was inevitable, the natural consequence of their behavior. He wasn't wrong, but it didn't make it any easier to digest. Before I could fully process the news, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Emma, who had apparently seen the article too. She asked if I was okay and offered to talk if I needed. I appreciated her concern, but I didn't have the energy to respond. My thoughts were consumed by the chaos back in my parents' house. I could only imagine the meltdown my mom was having and how my dad would try to clean up the mess. The next morning, my phone buzzed nonstop. I'd forgotten I had unblocked my parents' numbers. Their calls and texts poured in, filled with pleas for me to come home and help. My mom's messages were desperate, filled with guilt-laden phrases about family and unity. My dad's messages were sterner, accusing me of abandoning them when Olivia needed support the most. Sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through their texts, I felt an overwhelming mix of anger and sadness. Logan walked in, took one look at me, and shook his head. "Don't do it," he said simply. He didn't have to explain. I knew exactly what he meant. Logan's words echoed in my head as I tried to focus on my day. He was right. They'd try to guilt me into fixing everything, and I'd end up paying for my sister's mistakes yet again. I told myself I wouldn't let that happen, but the constant buzzing of my phone made it harder to ignore. By lunchtime, the pressure had worn me down. I called my mom, hoping to get some clarity without having to face my dad's stern lectures. She answered on the first ring, her voice breaking with relief. She launched into an emotional explanation, her words tumbling out in a shaky torrent. Olivia was in trouble, real trouble, she said. Her tone was pleading, almost frantic, as she tried to justify everything. I listened, trying to stay calm, but when she said it wasn't what I thought and called it a mistake, my patience wore thin. They'd been caught shoplifting. How was that anything other than what it seemed? Then she dropped a bombshell. Aiden had convinced Olivia to do it. He told her it would be fine, that they wouldn't get caught. My mom insisted Olivia hadn't wanted to go along with it, but had been pressured by Aiden, who had such a strong hold over her. I slumped back against the wall, processing her words. Olivia wasn't innocent in this mess, but the idea of Aiden manipulating her like that made my anger burn hotter. When I asked why she was telling me this, my mom's voice broke. Olivia needed me, she said. They needed me. She begged me to come home, to talk to Olivia and help figure out a solution. I couldn't help but laugh bitterly at the irony. The last time I'd been there, they treated me like a walking wallet, and now they wanted me to fix the disaster they'd allowed to happen. Her voice cracked as she begged me not to turn my back on the family. She sounded broken, desperate. Against my better judgment, I agreed to come over, but I made it clear I wasn't staying and wasn't going to fix their mess. When I arrived, the house felt different, tense, almost suffocating. My mom looked pale and frazzled, her usual composure gone. My dad, usually stoic, seemed exhausted, the lines on his face deeper than I remembered. They pointed me upstairs, where Olivia had locked herself in her room since the day before. I knocked on her door, unsure of what I'd say. After a long pause, the door creaked open, and Olivia stood there. She looked like a shadow of herself, eyes red from crying, hair disheveled, and a blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She mumbled something dismissive, but I stepped inside anyway. The room was a mess, and so was Olivia. She avoided my gaze, mumbling that I already knew what had happened. Aiden, she said, had convinced her they had no other choice. My frustration boiled over. Of course they had a choice. She didn't have to listen to him. But Olivia snapped back, insisting I didn't understand. Aiden loved her, she said, and he was the only one who did. I couldn't help the bitter laugh that escaped me. Love? Convincing her to commit a crime wasn't love. It was manipulation. I told her as much, but she lashed out, defending him. I sighed, shaking my head. I didn't know Aiden, but I knew Olivia. She was better than this, and I told her so. Why was she letting someone drag her down to this level? For a moment, she was silent. Then, she buried her face in her hands and began to sob. It was the first time in a long time that I didn't feel angry with her. Only sadness. My baby sister, who I'd always thought of as tough and headstrong, was falling apart. She whispered that she didn't know what to do anymore. I told her the truth as gently as I could. She needed to wake up. Aiden wasn't her future. He was a dead end. She didn't respond, but as I left the room, I thought I saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. Downstairs, my mom was waiting anxiously, wringing her hands. She asked me how it went, her voice barely above a whisper. I told her the truth. Olivia was a mess, but she wasn't hopeless. My mom looked like she was on the verge of tears again, but she just nodded and thanked me for coming. I told her not to thank me yet. I wasn't here to fix this for them. Olivia needed to figure out her own life. The drive back to Logan's was quiet, but my thoughts were anything but. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, that something bigger was looming just beyond the horizon. For now, all I could do was wait and brace myself for whatever came next. I wasn't ready for what came next. For days, Olivia lingered in my thoughts. I told myself it wasn't my problem, that she'd made her choices and had to face the consequences. But seeing her so broken had stirred something in me, a part of me that still saw her as the little sister I'd grown up with, the one I used to tease but also protect. I couldn't shake the feeling of responsibility, even though I knew I shouldn't feel that way. Logan noticed my unease. He had a knack for reading me, and it wasn't long before he called me out on it. He reminded me that I'd done everything I could, that it wasn't my job to save her. As much as I wanted to believe him, I couldn't silence the nagging voice in my head telling me I hadn't done enough. Then came the text from my dad. It was brief but unsettling. "Come to the house tonight. We need to talk. It's important." My dad wasn't one for dramatics, so the fact that he reached out like this made me uneasy. I showed the message to Logan, who shrugged, cautioning me not to let them guilt me again. Despite his warning, I couldn't ignore the feeling that this was different. That evening, I pulled into my parents' driveway with a familiar heaviness in my chest. The house looked the same as always, but it felt different, tense, almost foreboding. Inside, my parents were sitting at the dining room table, their expressions grim. My mom looked anxious, wringing her hands, while my dad wore the unreadable look he reserved for the most serious of situations. Olivia was there too, slouched in her chair, her eyes puffy and distant. Aiden was notably absent, which I thought was probably for the best. I sat down reluctantly, wary of another lecture. But this wasn't about me. It was about Aiden. My dad handed me a folded piece of paper. His tone was heavy as he explained that after the arrest, they'd started digging into Aiden's background. They hadn't wanted to pry, but they were worried. What they found, he said, shook them. I unfolded the paper and scanned its contents. It was a police report. Aiden's name was listed at the top, followed by a series of charges: petty theft, fraud, and, most chillingly, domestic assault. My stomach turned. This wasn't just about Aiden being lazy or manipulative. This was dangerous. My mom explained, her voice trembling, that Olivia refused to believe them. She insisted Aiden had changed, that he wasn't the man he used to be. I turned to Olivia, who had been silent until now. Her head snapped up, and her eyes blazed with defiance. She accused me of prying into her life, claiming it wasn't any of my business. That set me off. How could it not be my business when my sister was entangled with someone like this? I tried to reason with her, but she cut me off, yelling that I didn't understand him. He loved her, she said, and I couldn't possibly know what they'd been through. I laughed bitterly, not out of humor, but disbelief. Love? I told her love didn't look like manipulation and criminal records. Love didn't convince you to commit crimes. Olivia's bravado faltered for a moment, her lips trembling, but she held her ground. She didn't answer me directly, only crossed her arms and stared at the floor. I softened my tone, trying a different approach. I told her she deserved better, that Aiden wasn't her future. He was a dead end. For the first time, I thought I saw something crack in her expression, a flicker of doubt. But just as quickly, it was gone. She shouted back that I was jealous, that I couldn't stand the fact that our parents loved her more. Her words hit harder than I expected. They weren't true, at least not in the way she meant them, but they stung nonetheless. My mom gasped, clearly shocked, while my dad slammed his hand on the table, his voice booming as he told Olivia to grow up. She stormed out of the room, slamming her door so hard it rattled the walls. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. My mom broke down sobbing, while my dad rubbed his temples, looking utterly defeated. I sat there, hollow and drained, staring at the police report on the table. "What now?" I asked finally, my voice flat. "I don't know," my dad admitted. He looked at me, his exhaustion evident in every line on his face. "I just don't know anymore. When I left that night, I felt empty. Olivia was drowning, and there was nothing I could do to pull her out. I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the empty street. I wanted to scream, to shake her out of the hold Aiden had on her, but I knew it wasn't that simple. Finally, I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a familiar name. I sent a quick message to Emma. "Hey, are you busy? I could really use someone to talk to." Her reply came almost instantly. "I'm here. Want to come over?" I didn't hesitate. I needed to get out of my own head, and Emma had always been good at grounding me when the world felt like it was spinning out of control. When I arrived at Emma's place, she greeted me with a warm smile and a hug I didn't realize I needed. There was a calmness about her that immediately put me at ease. She led me inside, handed me a glass of water, and motioned for me to sit. Her concern was genuine, and when she asked me to start from the beginning, I felt the dam break. I told her everything. The absurd rent hike, Olivia's arrest, the police report about Aiden, and the blow-up with my family the night before. I laid it all out, each piece more surreal and exhausting than the last. Emma listened intently, nodding occasionally, but never interrupting. When I finally ran out of words, she let out a quiet sigh. "That's a lot," she said softly, her eyes full of empathy. "Yeah," I replied, my voice heavy. "And I don't even know what to do anymore. Part of me just wants to cut ties completely, but it's your family," she finished for me. "Exactly." She reached over and squeezed my hand. "You can't save your sister, Landon. She has to save herself. But that doesn't make you a bad brother for stepping back." Her words hit me in a way I didn't expect. I hadn't realized how much I needed someone to tell me that. I felt a flicker of relief, a small crack in the wall of frustration and guilt I'd been carrying. For the first time in weeks, I thought maybe things would eventually be okay. But I was wrong. The next day, everything fell apart. It started like any other morning. Logan and I grabbed coffee and made small talk, but I couldn't shake a nagging feeling of unease. It was as if I were waiting for the other shoe to drop, and when it did, it hit harder than I could have imagined. Around noon, my phone rang. It was my mom. Her voice was trembling, and I could hear the panic in her words before she even explained what had happened. Olivia was gone. She'd packed up her things in the middle of the night, left a note, and disappeared with Aiden. I sank on a Logan's couch, pressing my hand to my forehead as my mom recounted the details. The note said she loved him, that she was sorry, but she needed to live her own life. My dad was furious, my mom was scared, and I felt an ache I couldn't describe. For weeks, I'd been angry with Olivia, frustrated by her choices, but hearing she'd left, it hurt in a way I wasn't prepared for. My mom pleaded with me to find her, to bring her back, but I couldn't give her the answer she wanted. "I'll think about it," I said finally, knowing full well I was torn between stepping in and stepping back. That evening, Emma came over with takeout and her usual calm presence. We sat on the couch, and I told her everything. She listened quietly, her expression soft but serious. When I finished, she asked if I thought Olivia was okay. "I don't know," I admitted. "If she's with Aiden, probably not. He's bad news." Emma reminded me that I couldn't control Olivia, that I'd already done more than most would in my position. I knew she was right, but the thought of my sister out there, potentially in danger, gnawed at me. 2 days later, my phone buzzed, and Olivia's name flashed on the screen. For a moment, I thought it was a mistake, but when I answered, her shaky voice came through. She needed my help. Aiden had abandoned her at a motel, taking everything, her money, her trust, her sense of security, and leaving her with nothing. When I pulled into the rundown motel parking lot an hour later, I spotted her sitting on the curb with a duffel bag at her feet. She looked nothing like the sister I remembered, pale, disheveled, and hollow-eyed. I crouched beside her, and for a moment, we just sat in silence. "I messed up, Landon," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Yeah," I said, not sugarcoating it. "You did." Her lip quivered. "I thought he loved me. I thought." I sighed, sitting down beside her. "Olivia, I've been telling you for months that Aiden wasn't good for you, but you didn't want to listen." "I know," she said, her voice breaking. "And now I've lost everything. Mom and Dad probably hate me. You probably hate me." I shook my head. "I don't hate you. I meant, But you're my sister, and you're lucky Aiden's gone, because I'd knock him flat if I saw him right now. She let out a broken laugh, a flicker of the Olivia I used to know. You've always been the big brother who thought he could fix everything. I can't fix this, I said honestly, but I can help you get back on your feet if you're ready to try. She turned to me, her expression softening. You'd really help me? After everything? You're still my family, I said, but things have to change. No more excuses, and no more letting Mom and Dad enable you. You want my help, you're going to have to fight for yourself, too. She nodded slowly, her tears falling freely. Okay, I'll try. When we got back to my parents' house that evening, my mom burst into tears and hugged Olivia like she thought she'd never see her again. My dad stayed stoic, but I could see the relief in his eyes. Olivia apologized, her voice trembling, and for the first time, I believe she meant it. I didn't stick around long. I told my parents they needed to get her real help this time. Therapy, a job, anything to get her moving forward. For once, they listened. That night, Emma came over again. We sat on Logan's balcony with a bottle of wine, watching the city lights in silence. Eventually, she asked how Olivia was doing. She'll be okay, I said. Not right away, but I think she's finally ready to change. Emma smiled softly. And you? Are you okay? I thought about it for a moment, then nodded. Yeah, I think I am. For the first time in weeks, I felt like the weight had been lifted. My parents, my sister, even Aiden, it wasn't my job to fix them. I could be there for them, sure, but I couldn't keep sacrificing myself for their messes. Emma leaned her head on my shoulder. You did good, Landon. You're a better brother than most. Thanks, I said, exhaling deeply. I'm just ready to move on. And for the first time in a long time, I actually believed it.